He asked, after you find the property, then what?
So this question can be interpreted a couple different directions. I'm not sure if after he initially spots the property, what he should do, or after he finds it and purchases the property, then what he should do. But we'll talk about both because they're both really good questions. After you find the property, it depends. If you found it on Zillow and you don't have an agent or you haven't spoken with a lender, then those two things are probably the first couple things you should do. The other thing, if you know an investor, if you consider someone a mentor, run all the numbers, right? You have to do the work. You can't just go ask them what they think about this property, right? That if you have an actual person that you consider a mentor that is in this business, he's going to be busy or he's going to have family to attend to, right? He can't just be sitting there evaluating your deals. So you're going to have to do the deal or you have to do the work on it. But evaluate the deals, crunch the numbers, and then just submit a spreadsheet and say, hey, like, what do you think about this? Like, is this something you would consider? Take that to your agent, see if he spots something flawed in it. Take it to your lender, see if they spot something. Maybe go to a real estate investing, group, see what they say. Put it on Bigger Pockets forums, something maybe we don't talk about enough, right? Bigger Pockets forums allows you to do that all the time, and you'll get people, investors from all over the country to critique your numbers or your deal, right? And maybe you'll find someone in your local market that say, hey, like, this is something that I didn't consider. The point is, during that process, evaluate the deal and then make an offer if you think it's good. Because we talked about in a previous question is the fact that, like, for me, I don't do my hardcore due diligence until after the offer is accepted because it's just wasting your time, right? You, as an agent, I know that there are many contingencies that you can back out of the deal if something comes up that wasn't initially, thought of or seen, right? For instance, if there's major foundation issues and you didn't see it when you originally made your offer during that 10-day, contingency to do your inspection, you can back out of that, right? So make an offer, right? Figure out what number it is that you can cash flow or what number you feel comfortable with buying the property based on, properties in the area and all of that, right? Make an offer. Once it's accepted, then do serious due diligence. But then let's talk about the flip side of that. Let's say that this question was aimed at after you buy the property, what you should do. Okay. So again, that can go many different ways. We're going to keep it pretty simple here. Whether you have a multi-unit or rent by the bedroom or Airbnb, whatever it is, right? Figure out what you want to do with it as far as trying to house hack and eliminate your mortgage. And then, go about finding the best way to promote the property. For us, for you and I, both of us, we love Facebook Marketplace. I mean, 98% of, probably more, probably 99% of the tenants, or at least the contact I get, is from Facebook Marketplace, from potential prospects to rent my properties. So I love that. I mean, I've tried Craigslist. I've never had any good luck with good tenants from Craigslist. There's apartments.com, there's Zillow Rent. I mean, there's a million different, Trulia has one, Zumper, some people use in certain markets. Figure out which ones work in your market. Maybe Facebook Marketplace, you can just ask, hey, say I'm in Boston. Hey, in Boston, what's the best one to use? Or I'm in Denver, what's the best one to use? Or I'm in LA or Orange County or San Diego or, anywhere, wherever you're in the country, maybe ask on, different investor pages in the forums of Big Pockets, figure out, how to rent it, how to get clients. After you do that, set up a lease, right? Get it, find a really good lease, talk to a lawyer. Bigger Pockets has state specific leases that are nice initial ones. You're going to want to critique it to your own personal philosophy, but they have a real nice 13-page, if you're a pro member, but 13-page state-specific lease, right? You can use that if you're trying to do a long-term lease. If you do an Airbnb or short-term rentals, you'll have your own specific or deals. Airbnb sets that up for you, but I'm just saying other short-term ideas. And then rent by the room is a little bit different. So, we can go into weeds with all those. But then finally, the last thing that a lot of people don't consider, you got the property, you have it leased, you have a good lease in place, you have good tenant in place. The next thing to consider is the long-term prospects of this property, right? As you and I both know, properties break down over time. That's why the government allows us to depreciate and write off against the property because they know that properties break down over time. So you want to not only are you getting tax benefit from it, but you also want to put reserves in there. There's a reason that banks, if you're not a house hacker, again, this is a key point to remember, but banks require reserves if you buy a straight up investment property. If you don't live in it, they're going to require 20 to 25% down payment and reserves, which is usually like 4 to 6 months. You need the expenses of 4 to 6 months in a bank account set aside for this property. Banks require that. A lot of people don't even realize that, how good we have it as house hackers. But there's a reason for that. There's a reason that banks require that, right? 2008 is a great example. How many people lost their property because they weren't prepared for each individual property for something like that to happen, right? So, get a reserve on that property before you go get the second one. I'm speaking as a little bit of a hypocrite because I went and bought it and then I created my reserves for my properties. But maybe you're in a growth stage and you feel comfortable taking on a little bit more risk. That's fine. But eventually you gotta have reserves for each individual property so that you can weather storms. So you can, when something comes up, you fix that. Now we have that in place and we're ready to, whatever happens with the property, we can fix it, right? So make sure you consider that as well after all the, the obvious things like putting a tenant in place and the lease and, making sure maybe you renovate it to a certain level after you buy it, maybe, paint and flooring, whatever you got to do to get a good quality tenant. If that's your objective, which has always been mine, is to get the highest quality tenant. So I make my places look nice. Is then reserves. I think that's an important thing to remember.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, maybe if you don't have those reserves right away, which it would be good to have, it's going to help with peace of mind. And if anything happens, but if you don't have that and you really want to get started, you can get in there and I would immediately start saving those reserves. Like that should be objective one with your savings and determine how many months worth of operating expenses that you need for those reserves. Because there's things you got to consider. You have to consider vacancy. You have to consider if something's going to go out, unexpected expenses. For me, like I bought a property in the winter. I had 2 trees that were completely dead and I didn't find out till the spring and they're covered in termites. That was a completely unexpected expense that popped up. And that's something that you want to be prepared for.
And, something to also consider with like Phil's question about BRRRR hacking versus, as an investment property versus as a house hack where you're the owner occupied. If you pull that money out as an owner occupied, you get to take much more money out, right? If it's your personal property. So now if you take that money out, you can then take that money and put it as reserves. And, on top of a down payment for another property. But now you pull that money out and you don't have to necessarily save for a long period of time to have that reserve. You now have a reserve for that property based on the money pull out. And then now every month you come in, you can, disperse into, reserves plus save up for additional places or personal life expenses, whatever it is, right? Like there are a lot of ways to come about getting to that reserve. But again, cash is king to a certain point. But cash flow and liquidity are really king, right? Because there were people that lost properties that had 80, 90% equity in them during 2008, but they couldn't service their loans. It doesn't matter, right? You can have 80%, right? You can have, it almost all the way paid off. But if you can't service your loan during, when you lose your job or whatever, like that's something to consider, right? You need liquidity in financial crisis like that because banks freeze their credit. Right. And so, I mean, we can get in the weeds again with this, like what happens when there's a downturn, but there inevitably will be a downturn if you're going to be a real estate investor. And this is something you got to think about, right? You need liquidity. That's another reasons why, Craig Kurlop from Bigger Pockets was on here and he talked about the huge advantage that you need to take advantage of, which is low down payments intros when you don't have to pay for the mortgage. Right. And he didn't necessarily speak to this, in the podcast, but he did speak to this, in the book. And his general terminology is the fact that liquidity is king. Having cash on, in reserves is much more important than, having cash into the property, equity in the property. And again, I'm not discouraging equity in a property. It's very good. You and I both actively try to create, large equity positions within our home. That's also important. But, that's not the only thing. You have to weigh the two, right? And, there's a lot of personal, biases involved with that, how much risk tolerance you have. So we can get in the weeds with that too. But just consider that. Reserves are very important.